When we think of the German Wehrmacht in World War II, we see a specific image created by propaganda newsreels. We see columns of panzer tanks, half-tracks carrying infantry, and motorcycles speeding across Europe. We see a Blitzkrieg, a lightning war powered by internal combustion engines and modern technology. But this image is a lie. The reality of the German army was not steel and gasoline. It was flesh and hay. The Wehrmacht was not a fully motorized force. It was a medieval army with a thin veneer of modern armor. This is the story of the 2.7 million horses that actually powered the Nazi war machine. It is a logistical audit of why Germany, the nation that invented the automobile, went to war on horseback. To understand the scale of this deception, we have to look at the numbers in 1939. When Germany invaded Poland, only 16 of their 103 divisions were motorized. The other 87 divisions relied entirely on marching on foot and using horses to pull their artillery and supplies. The lightning war moved only as fast as a horse could walk, about 20 miles a day. Why did Germany do this? It was a simple calculation of industrial capacity. German factories, like Opel and Daimler-Benz, simply could not build enough trucks to motorize an army of 3 million men. Furthermore, Germany lacked the oil to fuel them and the rubber to tire them. As we discussed in our previous videos, these resources were the hard limits of the Reich. So the planners made a fateful decision. The tanks, panzers, would get the engines. The infantry, the logistics, and the artillery would get the horses. They scoured the farms of Germany and occupied Europe, drafting horses just like they drafted men. A typical German infantry division in 1939 had 17,000 men and 5,000 horses. Think about the logistics of that ratio. For every 3 soldiers holding a rifle, there was 1 horse that needed to be fed, watered, and groomed. This created a logistical parasite. A truck consumes fuel only when it moves. A horse consumes fuel, fodder, 24 hours a day, even when it is sleeping. A single horse requires roughly 20 pounds of grain and hay per day. A division with 5,000 horses required 50 tons of food every single day, just to keep its transport alive. This meant that a huge percentage of the rail capacity was used not to ship ammo to the front, but to ship hay for the horses. The army was effectively hauling cargo to support its own transport system. In the invasion of France in 1940, this weakness was masked by the short distances. The campaign was over in 6 weeks, and the horses grazed on the lush fields of France. But in June 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, the horse logistics turned into a disaster. The distances in Russia were vast. The grass in the forests was poor quality. The German horses, bred in Western Europe, were used to high-calorie grain and oats. They could not survive on the rough thatch and straw found in Russian villages. As the army advanced deep into Russia, the supply trains couldn't keep up with the fodder requirements. The horses began to starve. They ate the thatched roofs off peasant cottages. They ate the bark off trees. When a horse weakens, it cannot pull an artillery gun through the mud. Soldiers had to drop their weapons and push the wagons themselves, exhausting the infantry. Then came the Rasputitsa, the season of mud. While trucks sank to their axles and spun their wheels, the horses actually performed better for a short time. A horse can pull a leg out of deep mud where a tire gets stuck. For a few weeks in October 1941, the horse was superior to the machine, but the physical toll was horrific. The mud sucked the energy out of the animals. Horses died of heart failure in the harness, dropping dead in the middle of the road. When the winter hit, the tragedy deepened. German horses were not acclimatized to minus 30 degrees Celsius. They didn't have thick winter coats like the native Russian Panje ponies. Thousands of horses froze to death standing up. The German soldiers, starving themselves, viewed the horses no longer as transport, but as food. A dead horse was a block of frozen meat that could keep a squad alive for a week. This cannibalization of their own transport system accelerated the collapse. Every horse eaten was a gun that couldn't be moved and a wagon of ammo that couldn't be delivered. Meanwhile, the Soviet army was fully adapting. They used hardy Siberian ponies that could dig through snow to find grass. And crucially, from 1942 onwards, the Soviets began receiving massive numbers of American Studebaker trucks. While the Germans were becoming more reliant on horses as the war went on, the Allies were becoming fully motorized. This is the key contrast. The US Army in World War II did not use a single horse for combat transport in Europe. Not one. It was the first fully mechanized army in history. When American GIs captured German units, they were often shocked. They expected a futuristic enemy. Instead, they found a column of wagons that looked like they belonged in the Civil War. The smell of a German column was not the smell of diesel. It was the smell of manure. The reliance on horses dictated the tactical speed of the German retreat. In 1944, when the Soviet Bagration offensive shattered Army Group Center, the Germans tried to flee. But you cannot retreat fast enough on a horse wagon to outrun a T-34 tank. The motorized Soviet spearheads surrounded and annihilated the horse-drawn German infantry. It was a collision of two different centuries, the 19th century logistics of Germany versus the 20th century logistics of the Allies. The German Veterinary Corps was the largest in history. They employed highly skilled vets who performed surgery on horses in the field, but they couldn't fix the fundamental problem: attrition. Germany lost roughly 1.5 million horses during the war. They simply couldn't breed them fast enough to replace the losses. A tank takes a few weeks to build. A horse takes 4 years to grow. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was demotorizing. Panzer divisions that had started the war with trucks were forced to switch back to horses because there was no fuel. This de-modernization is a rare phenomenon in history. Usually, armies get more advanced as a war progresses. Germany got more primitive. We must also look at the Panje wagons. Desperate for transport, the Germans stole hundreds of thousands of peasant carts from occupied Russia. These were crude, wooden carts with no suspension. They broke constantly, cluttering the roads with debris and slowing the retreat to a crawl. The image of the master race retreating in stolen wooden carts pulled by starving ponies is the ultimate irony of the war. It exposes the hollowness of the Nazi industrial claim. Hitler wanted to fight a global war, but he had the industrial capacity of a regional power. He built V-2 rockets and jet fighters, technological marvels that cost billions. But he couldn't build a simple 2.5-ton truck to carry bread to his soldiers. This misallocation of resources, prioritizing wonder weapons over basic transport, was fatal. If Germany had scrapped the V-2 program and the heavy tanks, they could have built 100,000 trucks. Those trucks might have allowed the Sixth Army to escape Stalingrad. But trucks require oil, and as we know, Germany had none. So the horse was not a choice. It was a necessity of resource poverty. There is a grim efficiency to the horse in a collapsing economy. It is self-replicating. It fuels itself on grass, in theory. And when it breaks down, you can eat it. It was the ultimate recyclable transport for a nation that had run out of everything. But in a war of maneuver, the horse is a liability. It is vulnerable to shrapnel. A truck can have a tire shot out and be fixed. A horse with a broken leg is finished. Artillery barrages that would just damage vehicles would wipe out entire transport columns of horses. The roads of the Eastern Front were paved with the carcasses of these animals. The psychological impact on the soldiers who loved their horses was profound. German soldiers often wept when they had to shoot their animals. It was a bond of shared suffering in the mud and snow. But the High Command viewed them as numbers in a ledger. Draft animals, Type 4. The Battle of the Bulge in 1944 is often depicted with king tigers and panthers. But behind those tanks were thousands of horses dragging supplies through the Ardennes. When the attack stalled, the roads became clogged with horse-drawn traffic. Allied fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts, descended on these columns. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The wreckage of wagons and horses blocked the roads so effectively that the German tanks couldn't retreat. The logistics trapped the combat units. This failure proves that a military is only as fast as its slowest component. You can have a jet fighter that goes 500 mph. But if your fuel arrives at 3 mph on a horse, your army moves at 3 mph. The Allies understood this. The Red Ball Express moved at 40 mph. That speed differential is what allowed the Allies to encircle the Ruhr. The myth of the mechanized Wehrmacht persists because of how we consume history. We watch the highlight reels. We play the video games. In games, you drive a tiger tank. You don't drive a hay wagon. History filters out the boring, the slow, and the embarrassing. But the reality is that the German army of 1944 had more in common with Napoleon's army than with the US Army. They marched on the same roads, at the same speed, facing the same logistical limits. The only difference was that Napoleon didn't delude himself into thinking he was a mechanized superpower. Hitler did, and that delusion cost millions of lives. So, when we analyze the defeat of Germany, we shouldn't just look at the oil or the winter. We should look at the horse. The horse is the symbol of an ambition that exceeded capacity. It is the symbol of a nation trying to conquer the world on a budget.